The prep chamber stretched before her like a vault of polished steel and shadow. Kalira Thane stood at the viewport watching Earth recede below the orbital station, a fragile blue marble growing smaller with each passing second. Her reflection stared back from the reinforced glass sapphire skin, catching the dim lighting, golden eyes unreadable, even to herself. 28 years old, three-time defending champion. Undefeated in every arena that mattered, and utterly alone. Her hands moved without conscious thought, checking the ceremonial armor one final time. Dark metal and bronze, intricate but functional, fitted to her frame with the precision of something that had been forged specifically for her body. It had been. Everything in her life had been forged specifically for her, shaped by expectation and tradition and the weight of 12 generations. The Valor Stone and Warhammer rested on its mounting, beside her wrapped in preservation cloth. She didn't need to see it to feel its presence. The weapon had been with her since her 16th birthday, the day her mother had passed it down in the formal ceremony that marked her transition from student to warrior. That day, her mother had placed the hammer in her hands and spoken the words that every Thane woman heard when she came of age. This hammer has never been lifted by any male. Not in courtship, not in challenge, not in 12 generations. You carry our legacy now. You carry our solitude. Kalira had understood the weight of those words even then, though she hadn't felt their full burden until years later. The Valor Stone wasn't just a weapon, it was a test, a measure, a barrier between her and every possibility of partnership her species recognized as legitimate. 23 males had attempted the courtship ritual. 23 times she had offered her personal weapon, according to Nicerian tradition, standing before each candidate with the hammer extended, watching them approach with confidence that crumbled the moment they wrapped their hands around the ancient handle. 23 failures. Some had managed to lift it waist-high before their arms gave out. Most couldn't raise it from the ceremonial stand at all. The strongest male in her species' recent history had held it at shoulder height for 4 seconds before his entire body began to shake with the strain. 4 seconds. She could hold it overhead one-handed for an hour without breaking form. The tournament officials had tested her 3 years ago during her first championship run. They wanted to establish baseline metrics, wanted to understand exactly how far beyond her own species' capabilities she had evolved. The results had been classified, but she knew what they showed. She exceeded the average Nicerian male strength by a factor of 3.7. She exceeded the strongest recorded Nicerian male by a factor of 1.9. In a culture that defined partnership through physical compatibility, through the male's ability to match the female's strength, she was unmatchable. The numbers didn't lie. The courtship rituals didn't lie. 23 attempts, 23 failures, and the growing certainty that she would spend her life as her great-grandmother had, and her great-great-grandmother before that. Powerful, respected, feared, solitary. A soft chime indicated 5 minutes to ceremony start. Kalira turned from the viewport, lifted the Valor Stone from its mounting with the ease of long practice. The hammer's weight settled into her grip like an old companion. 280 kilograms of compressed alloy forged in her homeworld's deep volcanic chambers, where pressure and heat transformed base metals into something that existed on the edge of what physics allowed. The head was massive, dark, with veins of iridescent blue running through its structure. The handle had been wrapped and rewrapped over generations, worn smooth by the hands of women who had carried the same burden. She moved toward the chamber exit hammer resting against her shoulder in the traditional carry position. The corridor beyond thrummed with the controlled chaos of preparation. Competitors from 33 species moved through their final rituals, accompanied by handlers and advisors and the ever-present neutral officials who maintained the tournament's careful balance. No one approached her. No one ever did. Champion's privilege meant isolation in a different form, respect that manifested as distance. The amphitheater entrance loomed ahead, massive doors that would open onto an arena floor designed to hold 300,000 spectators, with holographic feeds extending the audience to 2 trillion beings across the known galaxy. The Zenithian Games were the oldest continuous tournament in recorded galactic history, predating most species' space travel capabilities. Civilizations rose and fell, political structures shifted, economic powers emerged and collapsed. The games endured, and every 4 orbital cycles the strongest beings in known space gathered to test themselves against each other to establish hierarchy and position and the subtle power dynamics that shaped everything from trade agreements to military alliances. Kalira had won her first championship at 22, the youngest Nisarian female to claim the title in 400 years. She had defended it twice since then. Her species' government treated her victories as diplomatic triumphs, evidence of Nisarian superiority in the complex web of galactic politics. What they never acknowledged was the cost, the isolation that came from being too strong to be matched, the emptiness of returning home after each tournament to a society that celebrated her publicly and avoided her privately. The doors opened. Sound crashed over her like a physical force. 300,000 voices rising in recognition, in celebration, in the complex mixture of admiration and fear that had become so familiar she barely registered it anymore. The amphitheater stretched in all directions, tier upon tier of seating, rising toward a ceiling that opened to space itself, stars visible beyond the atmospheric containment field. Kalira walked onto the arena floor, her steps measured and deliberate. The ceremonial presentation required her to cross from the champion's entrance to the central platform, a journey of perhaps 200 meters that felt like walking through fire. Every eye in the amphitheater tracked her movement. Every holographic feed in the galaxy focused on her approach. She had learned years ago to let her mind drift during these moments, to separate her consciousness from her body and simply move through the motions that ceremony demanded. Her feet knew the path. Her muscles understood the performance. Her face maintained the expression that had been drilled into her since childhood, serene confidence without arrogance, strength without cruelty. The central platform rose from the arena floor, a circular stage perhaps 20 meters in diameter. The neutral arbiter waited there, an impossibly ancient being whose translucent skin seemed to shimmer with internal light. No one knew the arbiter's species. No one knew how long they had presided over the games. Tradition held that the arbiter had witnessed the first tournament thousands of years before most current civilizations had developed written language. Kalira ascended the platform steps, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her shoulders alongside the weight of the hammer. The crowd's roar diminished to expectant silence. 2 trillion beings waited. The arbiter's voice carried across all frequencies simultaneously, a sound that bypassed ears entirely and resonated directly in the mind. Welcome, Champion Thane. You honor us with your presence. Present your strength to those gathered. The ritual never changed. Kalira shifted her grip on the Valor Stone, brought it down from her shoulder to her right side. Then in a single fluid motion that had been practiced 10,000 times, she raised it overhead, one-handed, arm fully extended, the hammer held perfectly still, no tremor, no strain, just absolute control. The crowd erupted again. Kalira held the position, counting seconds in her mind. 10, 20, 30. Longer than strictly necessary, but ceremony had its own demands. At 45 seconds, she lowered the hammer, the movement as controlled as the lift. The arbiter's next words were part of a formula older than memory. For 12 generations, no male of any species has lifted Champion Thane's ancestral weapon. The Valor Stone stands a symbol of strength and supremacy unmatched across the known galaxy. She carries her legacy with honor. Something inside Kalira's chest twisted at those words. Legacy, honor, supremacy, solitude. She forced the thought away, maintained her expression of serene confidence, and began the slow turn that would allow her to face all sections of the amphitheater. The movement was ceremonial, a way of acknowledging the assembled beings, of allowing the holographic feeds to capture her image from every angle. Her gaze swept across the tiers. Corellian warriors in their predatory formation, Tolan representatives massive and dense occupying reinforced seating, species she recognized and species she didn't, all gathered to witness strength in its various forms. Then her eyes caught on something unexpected. The human delegation occupied a modest section in the mid-tier, easy to overlook among the more physically imposing species. Earth had been part of galactic society for only 7 years, barely long enough to establish basic trade relationships, certainly not long enough to have developed the kind of political weight that earned prominent seating. Most species would have sent their most impressive physical specimens to a strength tournament, beings chosen specifically to project capability and power. The human delegation seemed to have chosen differently. Their group was small, perhaps a dozen individuals, and none of them appeared particularly remarkable. Except one. A male seated slightly apart from the others, watching the ceremony, with an expression that struck Kalira as deeply wrong for the context. Not awe, not intimidation, not the hunger for power she saw in so many eyes when they looked at her hammer. Curiosity. He was studying the Valor Stone the way an engineer might study a structural problem. His gaze tracked the hammer's dimensions, seemed to calculate weight distribution, assess the way she held it. There was no fear in his expression, no desire for possession. Just analytical interest, calm and thorough. Something in Kalira's chest tightened. Not threat, not attraction exactly. Something more dangerous. Possibility. She completed her turn, descended from the platform, and moved back toward the champion's holding area. But the image of that human male stayed with her, burned into her memory with unexpected clarity. Dark hair with natural bronze highlights catching the amphitheater's lights. Weathered skin that spoke of outdoor work rather than military training. Lean muscle, the kind that came from practical application rather than aesthetic development. And those eyes, calm, assessing, unafraid. The opening ceremony continued for another 2 hours. Representatives from the ruling alliance made proclamations about friendly competition and mutual advancement. Competitors were introduced by species and specialty. The neutral arbiter offered the traditional blessing words in a language so old that translation matrices could only approximate their meaning. Kalira stood in her designated position and let the ceremony wash over her, barely processing the speeches and rituals. Her mind kept returning to that moment of eye contact, trying to understand what had been different about it. Most beings looked at her hammer and saw either a weapon to be feared or a prize to be claimed. The human had looked at it and seen a puzzle to be solved. The distinction felt significant in a way she couldn't quite articulate. When the ceremony finally concluded, she retreated to the champion's observation gallery, a private space that overlooked the secondary arena where preliminary strength trials would begin the following day. The gallery was designed for solitude, a place where the defending champion could observe other competitors without being observed in turn. She brought up the tournament roster on the holographic display, scrolling through names and species designations until she found the human delegation listing. 12 names. She cross-referenced against the seating chart, isolated the male who had caught her attention. Garrett Holloway, age 32, occupation listed as structural engineer. Former military service, separated 4 years prior. No competitive combat experience. No previous tournament participation. The file included a note from the human delegation's director marked as internal communication, but accessible through Kalira's championship security clearance. Selected as replacement for injured primary competitor. Background in practical engineering, not athletic competition. Instructions: maintain mid-tier performance, avoid distinguishing results. Goal is dignified participation, not advancement. Kalira read the note 3 times, trying to understand the logic. The humans had sent someone specifically instructed not to excel. Someone whose expertise was in structures and physics rather than combat. Someone they considered expendable enough that his failure would create no diplomatic incident. It made no tactical sense, unless they genuinely didn't understand what they had. The preliminary strength trials began at dawn cycle amphitheater time. Kalira arrived early, claiming her position in the observation gallery before the arena floor had finished its overnight reconfiguration. The secondary arena was smaller than the main competition space, but still massive by most species standards. Variable gravity fields allowed testing under different conditions. Resistance chambers could be calibrated for specific force measurements. The entire floor could be restructured to accommodate different trial formats. 17 competitors were scheduled for the first day's testing. The sequence moved through species by galactic registration order, which meant the human entry would come mid-morning. Kalira told herself she was observing all competitors with equal attention, maintaining the champion's duty to understand potential challengers. She was lying to herself and knew it. Her focus kept drifting to the human delegation's preparation area, watching Garrett Holloway as he went through minimal warm-up exercises. No elaborate rituals, no aggressive displays of strength, just methodical movement, testing range of motion, ensuring readiness. The first competitor entered the testing floor. A Corellian warrior, all coiled muscle and predatory grace, moving with the fluid economy of a natural hunter. Kalira watched his progression through the 5 testing stations, her analytical mind automatically cataloging strengths and weaknesses. Station 1, gravity resistance. The Corellian pushed against progressive resistance while standing in 1.3 times standard gravity. Respectable performance. He exceeded baseline strength measurements by 47%. Kalira's mental assessment noted the number. Competitive but not exceptional. He uses his species' natural advantages well. Efficient force application, but lacks the raw power necessary for championship-level advancement. Station 2, leverage and lifting capacity. The Corellian managed 72 repetitions before reaching failure threshold. Solid, predictable, within expected parameters for his species. The testing continued. Atolan, next massive and dense exceeding baseline by 63%. Impressive until Kalira considered that their species evolved in gravity nearly twice Earth standard. Adjusted for environmental factors, the performance was merely adequate. A reptilian species she didn't immediately recognize managed 71% above baseline. Worth noting, potential advancement to elimination rounds. Then the testing official announced the human entry. Garrett Holloway, human competitor, Earth delegation. Kalira leaned forward in her observation position, Butudan aware that she was showing more interest than Champion's detachment should allow. She didn't care. Something about this human had caught her attention in a way that transcended tactical assessment. He entered the testing floor without ceremony, acknowledged the official with a simple nod, and moved to the first station. The gravity chamber hummed to life around him, increasing environmental pressure to 1.3 standard. The task was straightforward. Push against progressive resistance, maintain position as force increased. Most competitors approached it as a test of pure strength using maximum power from the beginning. Garrett approached it like an engineering problem. Kalira watched him assess the resistance apparatus, studying angles and pressure points, with the same calm curiosity he'd shown when observing her hammer. He positioned himself carefully, distributing weight in a way that maximized leverage advantage. Then he began the push. 68% above baseline. Respectable, not exceptional, exactly mid-tier as his instructions apparently demanded. But Kalira's trained eye caught something. The official's measurements missed. He wasn't straining. His breathing remained controlled. His muscle engagement was significant, but not maximal. He was holding back. Station 2, leverage and lifting. Press a resistance beam from chest height to overhead extension against progressive weight increase. The Corellian had managed 72 repetitions. Garrett positioned himself at the apparatus, wrapped his hands around the resistance beam. His grip was different from the other competitors she noticed. Most gripped with maximum pressure, trying to dominate the apparatus through pure force. His grip was firm, but relaxed the hold of someone accustomed to handling tools for extended periods. Someone who understood that excessive tension created fatigue. He began the repetitions. 20, 40, 60. His form remained consistent, controlled. No degradation in technique. The officials made notations clearly expecting failure at any moment. 80, 85. At 85 repetitions, the officials signaled completion. Garrett lowered the beam, stepped back, barely breathing hard. That was nearly double the Corellian's performance. The officials conferred briefly, made more notations. No visible alarm, but Kalira could read the subtle shifts in their posture. Unexpected result. Requires attention. Station 3 tested sustained force continuous pulling against upward resistance. The apparatus measured ability to maintain pressure over time, testing endurance alongside raw strength. Garrett achieved 92 sustained pulls before the officials called time. The Toelen, with all his massive density, had managed only 87. Kalira's pulse quickened. This was no longer mid-tier performance. This was advancement-level capability. Either Garrett Holloway was ignoring his instructions, or he genuinely didn't understand how far above baseline he was performing. Station 4, grip strength. Simple in concept, devastating in execution. Wrap hands around calibrated sensors, apply maximum pressure. The sensors measured force in precise increments. Garrett's hands, weathered from years of structural work, wrapped around the sensors. He squeezed. The measurement display flickered, updated, 119% above baseline. The officials froze. 119% was championship tier performance. That was the kind of result that separated serious contenders from participants. Kalira found herself standing without conscious decision, Moving closer to the observation gallery's viewport, her entire attention focused on the arena floor, on the human male who had just shattered every expectation of mid-tier mediocrity. Then came Station 5, the hammer lift, not the Valor Stone. The officials used a replica constructed from identical materials measured to exact specifications. The same weight, the same dimensions, the same distribution that made the Valor Stone so difficult to manage. 280 kilograms of compressed alloy, the weight that defined Kalira's isolation. Competitors were required to lift it from shoulder height to full overhead extension. One-handed or two-handed, the choice was theirs. They had to sustain the overhead position for 10 seconds. The Corellian had managed it with visible strain, two-handed grip trembling at 8 seconds, but holding to 10. The Tolan had failed entirely, unable to raise the replica past chest height despite his massive strength. The reptilian competitor had achieved overhead position, but lost control after 4 seconds. Garrett Holloway approached the replica hammer with the same methodical assessment he'd shown at every station. He walked around it, studying it from multiple angles. His fingers traced the handles, wrapping, testing texture and grip. His eyes calculated weight distribution, center of mass, the physics of the lift. Then he wrapped both hands around the handle, lifted it from the stand, and brought it to shoulder height, testing the weight, confirming his calculations. Kalira stopped breathing. Garrett shifted his grip. One hand released, leaving only his right hand supporting the full weight. In a single fluid motion, he extended his arm overhead. Full extension. The hammer held perfectly steady. 10 seconds. 20. 30. No tremor, no strain visible in his posture. Just controlled strength, the same calm competence he'd shown throughout the entire testing sequence. The officials stared. The testing floor had fallen silent. Other competitors who had finished their trials had paused to watch. At 40 seconds, the lead official found his voice. Sufficient. You may lower the apparatus. Garrett lowered the replica hammer, slowly, both hands guiding it down, and set it back on the stand with care. The official's voice carried across the arena floor, amplified for all observers. Exceeds baseline strength measurement by 461%. Result requires verification. 461%. Kalira's hands gripped the observation gallery railing hard enough that the metal creaked under the pressure. 461% was impossible. That was 3 times her own species' strongest recorded performance. That was a result that changed everything. The testing floor descended into controlled chaos. Officials conferring rapidly. Competitors staring. The human delegation looking genuinely shocked, as if this result was as unexpected to them as it was to everyone else. And Garrett Holloway standing calmly at the center of the storm, showing no apparent understanding of what he'd just done. Kalira watched them escort him to a verification chamber. Watched the officials' urgent communications. Watched the tournament committee convene an emergency session. She watched and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the universe. 15 years. 15 years she'd trained before managing a one-handed overhead extension with her ancestral hammer. Years of practice and conditioning and genetic advantage combining to achieve what her species considered the peak of physical capability. This human male had walked onto a testing floor and matched that achievement with a replica on his first attempt with no apparent difficulty. The hammer's resistance wasn't absolute. It was contextual, circumstantial, dependent on factors she'd never considered because her entire culture had taught her to view strength as singular, as inherent, as a fixed quality that some possessed and others lacked. What if they were wrong? What if she had spent 28 years being measured against the wrong parameters? The verification chamber testing took 6 hours. Kalira remained at the observation gallery the entire time, watching holographic feeds of Garrett repeating the hammer lift again and again. 6 times total. The results were identical each attempt. 461% above baseline. One-handed overhead extension. No strain. The officials ran every diagnostic protocol. Genetic screening for modification, negative. Equipment malfunction analysis, negative. Environmental factors assessment, negative. The result was legitimate. Human physiology, unmodified, had simply exceeded every established performance parameter by a margin that forced complete reassessment of human athletic potential. By mid-afternoon, the Galactic feeds had caught the story. Calera watched news analysts dissecting the implications, watched economic forecasters projecting trade disruptions, watched political commentators discussing what this meant for humanity's position in galactic hierarchies. The tournament committee released a carefully neutral statement. Testing results unprecedented will be recorded and analyzed for significance to overall tournament outcomes, which meant they were terrified. Garrett Holloway was given provisional advancement to elimination rounds pending final committee approval. He was also confined to the human delegation's quarters pending investigation into whether Earth had concealed superior genetic engineering programs in their initial contact reports. Confined, isolated, separated from normal tournament social structures because his strength made him dangerous. Calera understood that isolation intimately. She remained in the observation gallery until evening cycle thinking about hammers and strength and the difference between absolute and contextual. Thinking about 23 courtship rituals that had failed because they measured compatibility through a framework that assumed Nicerian males represented the only possible baseline. Thinking about a human engineer who had looked at her ancestral weapon and seen not a symbol of her supremacy, but a puzzle to be understood. When she finally left the observation gallery, returning to her private champion's quarters, she carried a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She needed to know if Garrett Holloway could lift her hammer, not the replica, not the testing apparatus, the real Valor Stone, the weapon that defined her isolation. Because if he could, everything she'd built her identity on was wrong. Her entire understanding of strength, of compatibility, of the solitude she'd accepted as permanent condition of her power. Everything would change. And if he couldn't, if the replica results were somehow different from the ancestral weapon, then this hope she felt, this dangerous possibility, would die here and she would return to the familiar emptiness of being unmatched. Either way, she needed to know. The decision made, Calera began planning how to arrange a private meeting with someone who was technically confined to quarters under investigation and absolutely forbidden from unsupervised contact with other competitors. Champion's privilege had its advantages. She had clearances that allowed movement through secured areas. She had authority that made officials hesitate to question her actions. She had 28 years of understanding exactly how far she could push regulations before anyone would dare challenge her. It would have to be late in the station's night cycle. The human delegation quarters were monitored, but not heavily. If she moved, carefully maintained the pretense of routine champion security inspection, she could reach Garrett without triggering alarms. The risk was significant. If discovered, the political implications would be severe. Fraternization with a competitor under investigation could compromise her championship standing. Her government would be furious. The neutral arbiters might consider it grounds for disqualification. But Calera had spent her entire adult life making decisions based on duty and tradition and the expectations of others. She had followed every rule, met every standard, exceeded every requirement, and it had left her utterly alone. For once, for this one night, she would choose based on what she needed rather than what was expected. She would find out if Garrett Holloway could lift her hammer, and she would discover whether the solitude that had defined her life was truly inevitable or just the result of measuring against the wrong baseline. The station's night cycle brought a different quality of silence to the orbital complex. Systems that hummed with urgent activity during competition hours settled into maintenance mode, their rhythms slowing to match the reduced population movement. Calera moved through the quarters with the careful precision of someone who understood exactly how monitoring systems worked and where their blind spots existed. 2,200 hours station time. Most competitors would be in recovery protocols or strategic planning sessions. Security personnel rotated shifts at 2,300, creating a 15-minute window where coverage thinned at junction points. She had mapped the route 3 times, committed every camera angle and sensor range to memory. Champion's privilege allowed her access to security schematics under the pretense of personal safety concerns. No one questioned why the 3-time defending champion might want to understand the station's protective measures. The human delegation occupied a modest section in the outer residential ring, far from the premium quarters assigned to established galactic powers. Calera counted it as advantage. Less traffic, fewer witnesses. Lower probability of encountering officials who might question her presence. The corridor outside the human quarters stretched empty in both directions, lit by the dim amber that indicated rest cycle. Calera paused at the access panel, her security override already queued. One command and the door would open. One decision and everything would change. Her hand hesitated over the panel. What was she doing? She was champion of the Valorstone, defender of her species' honor, representative of 12 generations of warrior tradition. Sneaking through corridors in the middle of night cycle to confront a human male under investigation was beneath her position. Reckless, inappropriate, necessary. The words settled into her mind with absolute certainty. This was necessary in a way that transcended politics and protocol. She needed to know if the possibility she'd felt watching Garrett lift that replica hammer was real or just another form of hope that would crumble under actual testing. She entered the override command. The door slid open with barely a whisper. The quarters beyond were dark except for the soft glow of a workstation in the far corner. Garrett sat there, his back to the entrance, studying something on a holographic display. Structural diagrams, she realized. He was analyzing the arena's architecture. He didn't turn at the sound of the door opening. His voice carried calm awareness without alarm. I wondered how long it would take you to come. Kalira stepped inside, allowing the door to close behind her. The darkness felt intimate, confining in a way the Champions Gallery never did. You were expecting me? Garrett turned in his chair, his expression unreadable in the dim light. I exceeded baseline performance by 461%. The defending champion, who happens to carry a hammer of identical specifications, watched every second of my testing from the observation gallery. Yes, I was expecting you. He gestured to a chair across from his workstation. The movement was casual, unstudied, not the careful deference most beings showed in her presence, not the nervous tension of someone intimidated by her reputation. Just simple hospitality, as if her presence in his quarters at night cycle was perfectly ordinary. Kalira remained standing. Her hands moved to the ceremonial wrapping at her side, fingers finding the familiar weight she'd carried with her. She had brought the Valorstone, wrapped in traditional cloth disguised as equipment she might carry during a security inspection, but unmistakably present. Garrett's eyes tracked the movement. His expression shifted slightly, recognition dawning. That's not the replica. No. The word hung between them, heavy with implication. Kalira unwrapped the hammer slowly, letting the cloth fall away to reveal the ancient weapon in its full weight and presence. Even in the dim corridors, the iridescent blue veins running through the dark metal seemed to catch light that didn't exist, creating an impression of depth and substance that went beyond mere physical matter. You lifted the replica as if it weighed nothing, Kalira said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, rougher than the controlled tone she maintained in public. I need to know if you can lift this. Garrett stood, moving closer with the same careful assessment he'd shown during testing. His eyes studied the Valorstone with genuine interest, tracking the patterns in the metal, the worn smoothness of the handle, wrapping the precise balance that generations of use had refined. Why does it matter, he asked. Kalira felt heat rise in her face, grateful for the darkness that concealed the slight color shift in her sapphire skin. Nisarian tradition. When a female reaches maturity, she carries her personal weapon as symbol of her strength. If she chooses to consider a male as potential partner, she offers him the weapon. If he can lift it, if he can hold it steady, it proves physical compatibility. Proves he can stand beside her without being crushed by her power. And no one's been able to lift yours. It wasn't a question. Garrett's tone carried only statement of fact without judgment or pity. Somehow that made it easier to continue. The strongest male in recent Nisarian history held it at shoulder height for 4 seconds before his entire body began shaking with strain. Kalira extended the hammer toward Garrett, the formal offering position her culture had used for generations. I can hold it overhead, one-handed for an hour without breaking form. I've been told my entire life that I'm unmatchable, too strong for any male to stand beside, destined for the same solitude every woman in my lineage has known. She met his eyes, directly abandoning the careful neutrality she maintained in all public interactions. If you can lift this hammer, everything I've been taught about strength and compatibility is wrong. Everything I've accepted about my life is based on measuring against the wrong parameters. But if you can't, if there's something different about the ancestral weapon that the replica doesn't capture, then I return to what I've always known. The words came out rawer than she'd intended, vulnerability. She'd never shown anyone spilling into the space between them. I need to know Garrett, not for politics, not for the tournament, For me. Garrett studied her face for a long moment. Then he stepped forward, closing the distance between them until he stood directly before the extended hammer. His hands reached out slowly, respectfully, as if he understood the weight of what this moment carried beyond mere physical mass. His fingers wrapped around the handle where generations of Thane women had gripped it. The worn leather fit his hands as if it had been shaped for them, though Kalira knew that was impossible. The handle had been sized for Nicerian female proportions, slightly larger than human male average. Garrett lifted. The hammer rose from Kalira's hands smoothly, no hesitation, no struggle. Shoulder height, then higher. His right hand shifted position, slightly left hand, releasing as he brought the Valor Stone to one-handed overhead extension. Full extension, arm locked, the massive hammer held perfectly steady above his head. Kalira stopped breathing. 10 seconds. 20, 30, 40. No tremor in Garrett's arm. No strain visible in his posture. His breathing remained controlled even. The same calm competence he demonstrated during official testing, but here in the privacy of darkened quarters with the ancestral weapon that had defined her isolation for 28 years. At 50 seconds, he lowered the hammer, both hands guiding it down with the same care he'd shown lifting it. He set it gently on the floor between them, then straightened to meet her eyes. The silence stretched. Kalira felt something fundamental breaking open in her chest. Not pain exactly, but the sensation of a weight she'd carried so long, she'd forgotten it was there suddenly being lifted away. Her hands were shaking. She who had never shown physical vulnerability in her adult life, who had trained herself to absolute control in all circumstances, couldn't stop her hands from trembling. "You're not weaker because I can lift it," Garrett said quietly. "You're discovering that strength has more possibilities than your culture taught you." The words hit her like physical impact. Possibility. She'd never had possibility. From the moment she'd inherited the Valor Stone at 16, her path had been determined by tradition and biology and the mathematical certainty that no Nicerian male could match her strength. But this human engineer, this being from a species that had only joined Galactic Society 7 years ago, had just shattered that certainty with a simple demonstration of capability. "I don't understand," she managed. "The replica and the ancestral weapon have identical specifications." How Garrett's expression gentled. "Your species evolved on a world with higher gravity than mine. Everything about your physiology developed to handle that increased gravitational pressure. The hammer was forged in that same environment. Its weight, its resistance calibrated to what would be heavy for someone with your species' capabilities." He gestured toward the Valor Stone resting between them. "I evolved in lower gravity, different leverage advantages, different muscle composition. The hammer that defines isolation in your culture is just physics in mine. Not superior, not inferior, just different parameters." Kalira sank into the chair she'd refused earlier, her legs suddenly unreliable. 22 years since she'd last cried, since she'd allowed herself the vulnerability of tears. But now they came silent tracks down her sapphire cheeks that she made no effort to hide. Garrett didn't move toward her, didn't offer empty comfort. He simply waited, giving her space to process the fundamental reorganization of everything she'd believed about herself and her place in the universe. When she could speak again, her voice came out rough with emotion. "I carried this weight so long I forgot what freedom felt like. Until you." She looked up at him, this human male who had given her something she'd stopped believing was possible. Not just the proof that someone could match her strength, but the understanding that her isolation had never been inevitable. Just the result of limited perspective of a culture that had defined compatibility too narrowly and never questioned whether their parameters were the only possible measure. Garrett moved, then pulling another chair to sit across from her at close range. "You're not just a champion, you're a person who's been told her entire life that her power made her unmatchable. That's cruel, Kalira. Strength shouldn't demand solitude." The words settled into spaces inside her that had been empty so long she'd forgotten they existed. She wanted to respond, to articulate the complexity of what she was feeling, but exhaustion was creeping in. The emotional weight of the night, combined with the physical tension she'd been carrying, finally overwhelming her usual defenses. "You should rest," Garrett said. "You've had more revelations in one night than most beings process in years." Kalira nodded but didn't move. The thought of returning to her champion's quarters, to the familiar isolation, felt impossible. I don't want to go back to being alone right now. The admission cost her something. Champions didn't acknowledge need. Leaders didn't show weakness. But she was so tired of performing strength without vulnerability, so exhausted by the weight of expectations that had shaped every moment of her public life. Garrett gestured toward the sleeping area in the corner of his quarters. It's not much, but you're welcome to stay. I'll keep working. She should refuse. Should maintain professional distance. Should remember that she was the defending champion and he was a competitor under investigation, and their presence together in private quarters would create diplomatic incidents if discovered. Instead, she moved to the sleeping area and settled onto the platform without argument. The quarters were modest compared to her champion suite, but there was something comforting about the simplicity. No ceremonial trappings, no weight of legacy, just functional space designed for rest. Garrett dimmed the lights further, returned to his workstation. The soft glow of his holographic displays provided just enough illumination for her to watch him work. He'd gone back to studying arena architecture, making notations with the focused attention of someone solving complex equations. Watching him work was oddly soothing. The careful precision, the methodical approach to problem solving, the quiet competence that didn't need to announce itself. She drifted towards sleep with the Valor Stone resting on the floor beside the sleeping platform, close enough to touch. For the first time in her memory, the hammer's presence didn't feel like burden. It felt like possibility. Kalira woke to urgent pounding on the quarters door and the harsh lights of emergency protocol flooding the space. Her combat instincts activated before conscious thought, rolling from the sleeping platform into defensive stance, hands reaching for weapons that weren't there. Garrett was already moving, his own training evident in the controlled speed of his response. He'd been at his workstation, apparently working through the night. Now he moved toward the door, his body positioning, creating barrier between the entrance and where Kalira stood. The door exploded inward, not opened, exploded. Someone had overridden the access protocols with enough force to fracture the structural frame. 3 figures poured through the breach, moving with the coordinated precision of professional operators. Assassins. The recognition came with absolute clarity. Kalira had trained against enough combat specialists to identify lethal intent and movement patterns. These beings weren't here to intimidate or capture. They were here to kill. The lead assassin was humanoid, but not human, with skin that seemed to shift colors as it moved, some kind of adaptive camouflage responding to environmental changes. Its limbs bent at angles that suggested additional joints, providing unnatural flexibility. The weapon in its hands was Corellian-designed curved blade, optimized for arterial strikes. The second and third assassins flanked their leader, carrying similar weapons, moving with the same disturbing fluidity. Kalira didn't waste time on questions. The lead assassin was already driving toward Garrett, blade angled for the killing strike that would open his chest cavity. She intercepted, her body moving through combat forms she'd practiced since childhood. Her hand caught the assassin's wrist mid-strike, redirecting the blade's trajectory into empty air. Her other hand drove toward the being's center mass strike, calculated to disable without killing. Tournament protocols forbade lethal force except in direct self-defense, and she didn't yet know if these attackers represented official challenge or criminal action. The assassin twisted with that unnatural flexibility, escaping her grip in ways Nisarian combat training hadn't prepared her for. Its blade came around in a reverse arc, forcing Kalira to block rather than press her advantage. The second and third assassins moved past their leader's engagement, converging on Garrett from both sides. Coordinated assault. They'd planned for her intervention, built it into their tactical approach. Garrett grabbed the nearest piece of furniture, a storage unit built into the quarters wall. With leverage that spoke of structural understanding, he wrenched it free and used it as mobile barrier, blocking the assassin's approach while giving himself space to maneuver. Kalira registered his action peripherally while maintaining focus on her opponent. The lead assassin was skilled, possibly enhanced, definitely trained in combat systems designed to counter superior strength through flexibility and speed. But it wasn't strong enough. Kalira caught its next strike, her grip crushing down on the being's wrist with enough force to shatter bone. The blade clattered to the floor. Before the assassin could recover, she drove her shoulder into its center mass, using her full weight and strength to slam it against the wall. The impact should have been disabling. Instead, the assassin used the wall as leverage point, pushing off to flip over her head in a maneuver that defied what she thought possible for humanoid physiology. It landed behind her, already reaching for a secondary weapon. Kalira spun, but not fast enough. The assassin's blade was coming up toward her neck, angled for the arteries that carried blood to her brain. Then Garrett was there, swinging the broken fragment of storage unit he'd torn from the wall. The makeshift weapon connected with the assassin's arm, disrupting the strike's trajectory. The blade passed centimeters from Kalira's throat instead of opening her arteries. She didn't waste the opening he'd created. Her finishing strike was precise, devastating, and absolutely necessary. The lead assassin collapsed unconscious or dead. She didn't have time to determine which. The second and third assassins had repositioned, flanking her again, with Garrett at her back. They moved in synchronized assault blades coming from multiple angles, simultaneously attack pattern designed to overwhelm even superior strength through coordinated pressure. Kalira and Garrett responded without discussion, their movements synchronizing as if they'd trained together for years instead of meeting days ago. She handled the assassin on the right, superior combat training, allowing her to predict and counter its strikes. Garrett used the confined quarters to his advantage on the left, furniture and structural elements becoming obstacles that disrupted the assassin's mobility. The fight lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, all three assassins were down. Kalira breathing hard, minor lacerations across her arms where blades had found gaps in her defense. Garrett bleeding from a cut along his ribs, not deep enough for serious damage, but requiring medical attention. Security forces arrived within seconds of the final assassin falling. They poured into the quarters with weapons drawn, taking in the scene with expressions that cycled through shock and confusion and carefully controlled professional neutrality. The human delegation's director, Evelyn Brennan, arrived 30 seconds later. Her gray eyes moved from the unconscious assassins to Garrett to Kalira, calculation visible in every micro-expression. Champion Thane Brennan said carefully, "This is unexpected." Kalira straightened, forcing her breathing back under control, assuming the posture of command despite the compromising circumstances. "I was conducting competitor analysis when these individuals breached the quarters with lethal intent. I defended myself and Garrett Holloway according to tournament protocols regarding self-defense." The lie was transparent. Competitor analysis didn't happen at 0300 hours in private quarters with the defending champion still present at dawn cycle. But it was a lie that provided plausible framework, and Brennan was experienced enough diplomat to recognize the gift being offered. The director nodded slowly. "I see. And these attackers?" "Professional operators," Kalira said. "Coordinated assault. Weapons are Corellian design, but that proves nothing. Professionals use neutral tools." The security chief, a crystalline being whose form refracted light in dizzying patterns, moved to examine the assassins. "We will conduct full investigation. In the meantime, both the champion Thane and competitor Holloway will need to provide detailed statements." The investigation consumed the next 72 hours. Kalira and Garrett were separated, immediately questioned extensively about the attack timeline and circumstances. The assassins, once revived, carried no identification. Their weapons were generic, unregistered. Their species was difficult to determine, suggesting genetic modification or natural camouflage capabilities that obscured origin. But one of them carried an encrypted data chip, military-grade security, that required specialized equipment to access. Kalira learned about the chip's contents in a private briefing 18 hours after the attack. She sat across from the neutral arbiter in chambers that seemed to exist outside normal space, listening to words that fundamentally altered her understanding of her government's character. The chip contained kill orders, specific and detailed. Eliminate human male Garrett Holloway before elimination rounds begin. Secondary objective, eliminate champion Kalira Thane if she interferes with primary objective. The authorization codes trace back through layers of intermediaries before terminating at Nicerian military command. Her own species leadership had approved a plan that included her assassination as acceptable collateral damage. "Your government did not directly order the attack," the arbiter explained in that voice that resonated beyond hearing. "But they provided resources to an economic cartel threatened by human emergence. They approved contingency plans that included your elimination if you proved unwilling to prioritize species loyalty over personal judgment." Kalira felt cold spreading through her chest. She had known Nicerian leadership valued power and position above individual lives. But she had believed naively, perhaps, that her championship status provided some protection, that her service to her species' reputation earned basic consideration. She had been catastrophically wrong. What happens now, she asked. The arbiter's translucent form shimmered. Investigation continues. Evidence is being compiled. But for you, Champion Thane, the question is more immediate. The encryption on that chip was sophisticated. Breaking it required resources and time. We have approximately 6 days before the cartel realizes their operation has been compromised and begins destroying evidence. 6 days until the elimination rounds begin, Kalira said slowly. Yes. The arbiter's tone carried something that might have been approval. You have a choice to make. Remain silent about what you've learned, protect your species from scandal, accept that your government was willing to sacrifice you as the cost of maintaining economic position, or expose the conspiracy, fully provide evidence that forces accountability, and accept exile from everything you have known. Kalira thought about Garrett, about the way he'd looked at her hammer and seen a puzzle instead of a symbol of supremacy, about the way he'd stood beside her in combat without hesitation, trusting her strength while offering his own, about the simple fact that for the first time in 28 years, someone had made her feel like she was enough exactly as she was. She thought about 23 failed courtship rituals and a lifetime of isolation, and the moment she'd finally understood that her solitude had never been inevitable. I need access to Nisarian military networks, she said. Champion clearances should still be active. I want to see the full scope of this conspiracy before I make my decision. The arbiter inclined their head. That can be arranged. But Champion Thane, you should understand what you're contemplating. If you access classified networks and discover evidence of institutional wrongdoing, remaining silent becomes complicity. Coming forward becomes betrayal. There is no neutral position once you have the knowledge. I understand, Kalira said, and I'm choosing to know anyway. Over the next 3 days, Kalira accessed levels of Nisarian military networks she'd never explored before. Champion clearance granted her remarkable latitude, and she used every advantage her position provided. What she found was worse than she'd anticipated. The conspiracy wasn't limited to a single assassination attempt. It was comprehensive, coordinated across multiple species, designed to suppress human economic advancement through any means necessary. The cartel had identified Earth as a threat 2 years ago, when preliminary trade negotiations revealed human capability in structural engineering, environmental adaptation, and resource extraction. Humanity's emergence as competitive labor force would devastate established trade relationships that had enriched cartel members for generations. The solution, according to encrypted communications Kalira accessed, was to ensure humanity never advanced beyond peripheral participant status in galactic economics. Sabotage their reputation, eliminate their most capable representatives, create incidents that would justify restricting Earth's market access. And Nisarian leadership had not just approved this plan, they had contributed resources, provided intelligence, facilitated the assassination attempt. Their reasoning was coldly pragmatic. Nisarian economic prosperity depended on trade agreements with cartel species. Human emergence threatened those agreements. Therefore, human advancement must be prevented. The contingency regarding Kalira's elimination was buried in a secondary document, clinical in its assessment. If Champion Thane proves unwilling to maintain professional distance from human competitor, her continued existence becomes liability rather than asset. Removal is authorized if operational security requires it. She had spent her life serving Nisarian interests, winning championships, representing her species with honor, following every protocol and tradition. And her government had calculated that killing her was acceptable if she interfered with their economic planning. Kalira downloaded everything, every authorization code, every encrypted communication, every piece of evidence that demonstrated institutional conspiracy to commit murder for profit margins. She stored it on isolated data chips that couldn't be remotely accessed or deleted. Then she made her decision. She found Garrett in the human delegation's medical facility on the 4th day after the attack. His injuries had been minor, already healed through standard medical intervention. He was sitting up, reviewing structural data on a portable display, the same focused concentration she'd observed in his quarters. He looked up when she entered. His expression shifted immediately to concern. "Are you all right?" Kalira moved to sit beside his bed, the gesture feeling more natural now than it had days ago. "We survived. That's more than many can say after professional assassination attempts." She reached out, took his hand. The physical contact still felt strange, unfamiliar. Nicerian culture reserved touch for formal context, combat, or courtship rituals. Casual intimacy between potential partners was considered presumptuous, but she was done following protocols that had left her isolated. Garrett's hand closed around hers, warm and steady. They tried to kill both of us. The investigation found evidence, Kalira nodded. Kill orders on an encrypted chip. Authorization codes traced back to Nicerian military command. My own government approved it. She met his eyes directly. They were willing to kill me for standing beside you. His grip tightened slightly. What are you going to do? I've accessed the full scope of the conspiracy over the past 3 days. It's not just about us. It's comprehensive economic suppression targeting Earth's emergence as competitive species. Sabotage, assassination, political manipulation. Multiple species involved, but Nicerian leadership provided critical resources. She pulled a data chip from her ceremonial belt, held it up. This contains everything. Proof that cannot be dismissed or explained away. If I submit this to the neutral arbiters, it destroys my position in Nicerian society. I'll be exiled from everything I've known, treated as traitor to my species. And you're willing to accept that? Garrett asked quietly. Kalira was silent for a moment, organizing thoughts that had consumed her for days. For most of my life, I believed strength meant standing alone, being powerful enough that no one could challenge me. The hammer, the championship, the isolation, all of it was supposed to prove my worth. But you've shown me something different. She squeezed his hand gently. Strength without choice is just another form of prison. I'm choosing truth over loyalty to a government that views me as expendable. I'm choosing partnership over supremacy. And I'm choosing you, Garrett Holloway, even though it cost me everything my species taught me to value. There's something you should know about Nicerian culture, she continued. When a female performs the weapon-sharing ritual, when she offers her personal weapon to a male, and he proves capable of bearing it, that's not just courtship demonstration. It's legally binding partnership declaration. Garrett's eyes widened slightly. The hammer. When I lifted the Valor Stone in your presence. By Nicerian law, we're bonded partners, Kalira said. I should have explained before offering the weapon, but I needed to know if you could lift it, if partnership was even possible. She watched his face carefully. If you want to contest it, there are provisions for non-Nicerians who didn't understand the legal implications. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious features. I lifted your hammer knowing what it meant to you, knowing it represented everything you'd been denied. If that makes us partners by your culture's law, I accept it. Relief flooded through Kalira so intensely she felt momentarily dizzy. You understand what you're accepting? I'm about to become the most controversial figure in Nicerian society. Your association with me will complicate Earth's diplomatic position. I'm a structural engineer who got pulled into this tournament because I was expendable, Garrett said. I've already complicated Earth's position by exceeding baseline strength by 461%. Accepting partnership with the defending champion who's exposing government conspiracy, that's just continuing the pattern. Despite everything, Kalira laughed. The sound felt rusty from disuse but genuine. The elimination rounds begin in 2 days. I'm submitting the evidence to the neutral arbiters tomorrow morning. By the time we compete, the entire galaxy will know about the conspiracy. So we'll be competing while our governments deal with political fallout, Garrett observed. Kalira nodded. And we might face each other in the finals. What happens then? His question hung in the air between them, weighted with significance beyond the literal words. Kalira considered carefully before answering. We show the galaxy what strength looks like when it's chosen freely, she said. When it's partnership instead of dominance. We redefine what victory means. The next 2 days blurred together in a cascade of political chaos that Kalira observed with strange detachment. She submitted the evidence to the neutral arbiters at dawn cycle 24 hours before elimination rounds were scheduled to begin. By mid-morning, the conspiracy was public knowledge across every galactic feed. The cartel issued immediate denials. Nicerian leadership called for independent verification. 17 species faced preliminary sanctions pending full investigation. Earth's diplomatic representatives suddenly found themselves negotiating from a position of unexpected strength. And Kalira existed in a liminal space between triumph and exile. She was technically cleared of any wrongdoing in the assassination incident. The evidence she'd provided proved she'd been targeted for elimination, which transformed her from potential conspirator to victim requiring protection. But the methods she'd used to obtain that evidence, accessing classified military networks and downloading sensitive communications, constituted violations that her government could not ignore. They stripped her of military rank within hours of the evidence going public. She retained her championship title because that had been earned through combat prowess, not political appointment. But she was effectively exiled from Nicerian power structures designated as diplomatic liability rather than asset. The neutral arbiters ruled that the elimination rounds would proceed as scheduled. Both Kalira and Garrett had earned their positions through legitimate performance. Political complications were irrelevant to athletic competition. Kalira spent the night before elimination rounds in a strange state of calm acceptance. She had lost everything her species had taught her to value. Military position, government approval, the respect that came from being celebrated, representative of Nicerian superiority. But she had gained something more valuable, the freedom to define her own strength, the knowledge that isolation had never been inevitable, and partnership with someone who saw her as equal rather than symbol. She found herself in a maintenance corridor late that night, one of the blind spots in the station's monitoring systems that she'd identified during her initial security review. Garrett was already there, having received her message through carefully encoded channels. The space was cramped utilitarian, designed for repair access rather than social interaction. But it offered privacy that their official quarters could not provide. "You're really doing this," Garrett said. "Not a question," Kalira nodded. "Evidence is submitted. Sanctions are being imposed. My government has officially disavowed my actions." She smiled without humor. "I'm a traitor to my species, apparently. Chose personal relationship over national interests. And how do you feel about that?" She considered the question seriously. "Lighter than I've felt in years, like I've been carrying weight I didn't realize was there until it was lifted." Garrett moved closer in the confined space. "Tomorrow we compete. The brackets have us on parallel paths. If we both advance, we face each other in the finals." "I know," Kalira said. "The galaxy will be watching, analyzing every movement, looking for evidence that our partnership compromises the competition's integrity." "Does it?" Garrett asked. "Compromise the integrity?" Kalira met his eyes directly. "No, we're both competing at our full capability. Neither of us will hold back. But we're not fighting for dominance anymore. We're demonstrating what strength looks like when it's built on mutual respect rather than need to prove superiority." She reached out, cupped his face with her hand. The gesture felt intimate, precious. "You've changed everything for me, Garrett. Not by being stronger, by helping me understand that strength has more possibilities than my culture taught me." He covered her hand with his own. "What happens after the tournament, assuming we both survive the political fallout?" Kalira had been thinking about that question for days. "I've been offered a position, ambassador of New Strength Doctrine. Basically, they want me to travel around explaining why the old models of dominance-based hierarchy are failing, helping species understand that partnership can be stronger than supremacy." "And would I be part of that if you want to be?" She felt vulnerability creep into her voice. "I know it's asking a lot. Your life would become complicated in ways you never anticipated. Constant scrutiny, political pressure, being defined by your association with me." Garrett was quiet for a moment, then he smiled. "I'm a structural engineer who became a tournament competitor by accident and exposed a galactic conspiracy by existing. My life is already complicated in ways I never anticipated. Adding partnership with you, that's the part that makes it worthwhile." Kalira felt something in her chest that had been tight for so long. Finally relaxed completely. She leaned forward, pressed her forehead against his in the Nicerian gesture of intimate trust. They stayed that way for a long time, two beings from different worlds who had found a way to meet as equals in the space between their differences. The following night, Kalira brought Garrett to a condemned observation deck that no longer appeared in active station systems. The space had been scheduled for decommissioning, which meant monitoring had been disabled. It offered complete privacy and a view of the galaxy that took her breath away. She'd brought the Valor Stone with her, not for testing this time. For ceremony, Garrett understood immediately when he saw the hammer. His expression shifted to something between reverence and recognition. "You said the weapon-sharing ritual makes us bonded partners by Nicerian law," he said carefully. But we performed that ritual in private with no witnesses under circumstances that could be challenged. Kalira nodded. I want to perform it again, properly, with full understanding of what it means and what we're choosing. She lifted the Valor Stone, held it in both hands at chest height, the formal position for offering a personal weapon to a chosen partner. In my culture, this ritual is sacred. It's how we recognize partnership that transcends simple attraction. When I offer you this hammer, I'm offering you access to my strength, my vulnerability, everything that I am. If you accept it, if you can bear its weight, we're bound together in a partnership that my people recognize as permanent. She met his eyes directly. I'm offering you this choice with full knowledge of what it costs and what it means. You'll be bound to someone exiled from her own species, someone controversial and politically complicated. But you'll also have a partner who will stand beside you regardless of what comes, who sees your strength and isn't intimidated, who trusts you enough to be vulnerable. Garrett stepped forward, placed his hands on the Valor Stone's handle below hers. I accept. The Nysarian bonding words came to Kalira's lips in her native language, phrases she'd never expected to speak in genuine ceremony. She translated as she went, wanting him to understand every nuance. I choose you as my equal. My strength is yours to rely upon. Your strength is mine to trust. We are one in purpose, balanced in power, matched in courage. What I carry alone becomes lighter when shared. What you face alone becomes bearable with support. We are bonded from this moment forward in the sight of stars and the witnessing of our own hearts. Together they raise the Valor Stone overhead. Not her lifting alone, not him proving capability. Both of them hands intertwined on the ancient handle, raising the symbol of her legacy as a shared burden and shared honor. When they lowered it, Kalira felt tears on her face again. But these were different from the tears she'd cried in Garrett's quarters days ago. Not grief for what she'd lost, joy for what she'd found. Garrett set the hammer aside carefully, then pulled her close. The kiss that followed was tender, careful, electrically charged with the significance of what they just committed to. They stayed on that observation deck for hours as the station's night cycle deepened around them. The physical intimacy that developed felt like natural extension of the emotional intimacy they had been building. Her strength carefully restrained so they could meet as equals. His presence allowing her vulnerability she'd never permitted herself before. It wasn't the simplified romance that stories promised. It was complex and sometimes awkward and required constant adjustment and communication. Her species' physiology was similar enough to his that intimacy was possible, but different enough that nothing could be taken for granted. But it was real. It was chosen. And it was theirs. When dawn cycle began to lighten the observation deck's viewport, they lay together watching stars slowly fade into the station's artificial day. The Valor Stone rested nearby, no longer a symbol of isolation, but a reminder of what they'd chosen. Tomorrow the elimination rounds begin, Garrett said quietly. We'll be competing while our governments deal with political crisis. The whole galaxy will be watching. Kalira smiled against his shoulder. Let them watch. We'll show them what strength looks like when it's built on choice instead of dominance. Do you think we'll face each other in the finals? Probably. The bracket's favorite. She turned to look at him directly. Will you be ready for that? Garrett's expression turned thoughtful. Ready to compete against my bonded partner in front of 2 trillion beings while demonstrating that partnership doesn't mean weakness. He smiled. That's the most important match I'll ever fight. Kalira felt certainty settle into her chest, solid and unshakable. Then we'd better make it spectacular. The elimination rounds began with a ceremony that felt different from the opening. The atmosphere had shifted. Where the initial gathering had been celebration of strength and competition, this felt more like witnessing the aftermath of an earthquake. The political landscape had fractured. 2 trillion beings across the galaxy were watching not just to see athletic prowess, but to understand what the conspiracy exposure meant for their own positions in the complex web of galactic power. Kalira stood in the champion's preparation area, listening to the ambient roar of the crowd through reinforced walls. Her ceremonial armor felt lighter than it had at the opening ceremony. Or perhaps she had simply grown stronger in ways that had nothing to do with physical capability. The door opened. Evelyn Brennan entered, her gray eyes tired but sharp with the alertness that came from navigating diplomatic crisis. Champion Thane, she said formally. Then with a slight softening of tone, Kalira, I wanted to speak with you before the rounds begin. Kalira turned from the mirror where she'd been making final adjustments to her armor. Director Brennan, I assume this is about the political complications my evidence created for Earth's position. Brennan's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement. Actually, the complications you created have worked significantly in Earth's favor. The cartel species are too busy defending themselves to maintain their coordinated economic pressure. We've gained negotiating leverage we wouldn't have had otherwise. She moved closer, lowered her voice slightly. What I wanted to say is thank you. Garrett Holloway is a good man who was pulled into this tournament because we thought he was expendable. You've proven he's anything but, and you've shown considerable courage in choosing truth over loyalty to a government that betrayed you. Kalira felt unexpected warmth at the words. Your species sent someone who changed everything for me. I should be thanking you. Brennan smiled. He speaks highly of you as well. Though I have to admit, when I learned you two had performed a legally binding partnership ceremony, I had a brief moment of panic about the diplomatic paperwork involved. Despite the tension of the approaching competition, Kalira laughed. I apologize for the bureaucratic complications. Don't. Brennan's expression turned serious. The galaxy needs to see what you and Garrett are demonstrating. That strength doesn't require dominance. That different species can find partnership instead of hierarchy. That's more valuable than any trade agreement. The announcement system activated calling competitors to their brackets. Brennan nodded once more and departed, leaving Kalira alone with her thoughts and her hammer. The brackets had been structured to maximize competitive drama. Kalira's path would take her through 3 elimination matches before reaching the finals. Garrett's path was parallel designed so that if they both advanced, they would face each other in the championship. Her first opponent was a Tolan, the same species that had exceeded baseline by 63% during preliminary testing. This particular Tolan was named Corvus, and he was massive even for his species. Nearly 8 feet tall with muscle density that came from evolution and gravity twice Earth standard. His bulk made the arena floor tremble slightly as he entered from the opposite side. The match format was simple: combat until one competitor yielded or was rendered unable to continue. Serious injury was within bounds. Death was technically prohibited but minimally enforced. Kalira walked onto the arena floor feeling the weight of 2 trillion eyes on her movement. But the pressure felt different now. She wasn't representing Nissarian superiority anymore. She was representing something else. The possibility that strength could exist alongside choice. That power didn't have to mean isolation. Corvus approached with the confidence of someone who had spent his life being the largest being in any room. His species didn't practice formal greetings before combat. They believed actions spoke more clearly than words. The signal sounded. Corvus charged immediately, using his massive weight as a weapon. The strategy was straightforward. Close distance used superior mass to overwhelm, crush the opponent through sheer physical pressure. It would have worked against most competitors. Kalira had spent 28 years learning how to counter beings who relied on mass advantage. She moved slightly off-center as Corvus's charge reached her position, redirecting his momentum rather than trying to stop it directly. The Tolan crashed past her, unable to adjust his trajectory quickly enough. Before he could recover, Kalira struck. Not with maximum force, but with precision. A blow to the nerve cluster at the base of his spine, disrupting his coordination. A second strike to his knee joint, exploiting the structural weakness that came from supporting such massive weight. Corvus roared, spinning to face her with impressive speed for his size. But the damage was done. His left leg couldn't support his full weight anymore. His coordination was compromised. The match lasted 7 minutes. It ended with Corvus on the arena floor, conscious, but unable to rise, his muscular system overstressed beyond safe recovery threshold. Kalira stood over him, offered the Nissarian gesture of respect for a worthy opponent. Corvus accepted it with the grace of someone who understood he'd been outmatched by superior technique rather than superior strength. The crowd's response was complex. Appreciation for the skill demonstrated, but also something else. A growing awareness that they were witnessing evolution in combat philosophy. Kalira hadn't dominated Corvus through raw power. She'd defeated him through understanding of physics and leverage in the precise application of force to critical points. She exited the arena knowing that Garrett's match was happening simultaneously in the adjacent competition space. She couldn't watch him compete, wouldn't know if he advanced until both matches concluded. The waiting was worse than combat. 15 minutes later, the results were announced across the amphitheater. Garrett Holloway had defeated his Corellian opponent in a 12-minute match that the commentators described as masterclass in structural understanding. He'd used the arena itself as a weapon, identifying weakness points and pressure zones that gave him advantages his opponent couldn't counter. They had both advanced. 2 matches left before the finals. The second elimination round took place 3 days later, allowing time for recovery and preparation. Calera's opponent was a reptilian species warrior who moved with disturbing speed, using venomous strikes that required her to maintain perfect defensive positioning throughout the match. She won in 14 minutes, the longest of her elimination matches, and emerged with minor lacerations from near misses that had come closer to landing than she liked to admit. Garrett faced a being from a species she didn't recognize, something that seemed to exist partially out of phase with normal space. The match was strange to watch on the holographic feeds filled with moments where Garrett appeared to be fighting empty air before his strikes connected with substance that flickered into visibility. He won in 11 minutes, and she could see the exhaustion in his movements afterward. They met briefly in the neutral recovery area, a space where competitors could receive medical attention regardless of species. The rules forbade extended contact between competitors who might face each other in upcoming matches, but they were allowed basic acknowledgement. "You're advancing well," Calera said, keeping her tone neutral for the officials who monitored every interaction. Garrett's expression was equally controlled. "You as well. The analysis I've seen suggests we're both likely to reach finals." The implications hung unspoken between them. One more match each. Then they would face each other in front of the entire galaxy-bonded partners, demonstrating that competition didn't have to mean enmity. The third elimination round was scheduled for 2 days later. Calera spent the intervening time in careful preparation reviewing footage of her final opponent, a Corellian female named Syrinx, who had won her previous matches with brutal efficiency. She also spent time with Garrett's stolen hours in the maintenance corridors and observation decks that had become their private spaces. They didn't discuss the upcoming finals directly. Instead, they talked about what came after, about the positions they'd been offered, about the future they were building together despite the political chaos swirling around them. The night before the third elimination round, Garrett pulled her close in the dim light of their hidden observation deck. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever happens in the finals, I want you to know something." Calera waited, feeling his heartbeat steady against her. "You've given me something I didn't know I was missing," he said. "Purpose beyond just existing. Partnership that makes me better than I am alone. The galaxy can think whatever it wants about us. I know what we are, and that's enough." She kissed him, then pouring everything she couldn't articulate into the physical connection between them. The third elimination match against Syrinx was the hardest fight of Calera's career. The Corellian fought with the kind of desperate intensity that came from understanding this was her last chance at championship glory. She was fast, skilled, and willing to accept damage if it meant landing critical strikes. The match lasted 19 minutes. It ended with both of them bleeding exhausted, pushed to the absolute limits of their capability. But Calera's precision ultimately overcame Syrinx's ferocity. A final combination, 3 strikes in rapid succession to nerve clusters that shut down the Corellian's left side, forced the yield. Calera helped Syrinx to her feet afterward, supporting the warrior's weight as medical personnel arrived. There was respect between them, the understanding that came from pushing each other to the edge of what was possible. In the adjacent arena, Garrett was finishing his own match. Calera watched on the holographic displays as he faced a being that seemed to be made of living metal, each strike sending resonant vibrations through the arena floor. His victory came through patience and analysis, finding the harmonic frequency that disrupted his opponent's structural integrity. They had both advanced to the finals. The championship match was scheduled for the following day, giving minimal time for recovery. Tournament tradition held that finals should test not just skill, but endurance, the ability to perform at peak capability, even when exhausted from previous matches. Calera spent the night alone in her quarters, knowing that Garrett was doing the same. They had agreed that the night before their final match should be solitary, each of them centering themselves for what was to come. She sat with the Valor Stone across her lap, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 28 years of isolation, believing that strength meant standing alone. 23 failed courtship rituals that had seemed to prove she was unmatchable. And then a human engineer had looked at her hammer and seen not a symbol of her supremacy, but a puzzle to be understood, had lifted it with the same calm competence he brought to everything, and in doing so had shattered every assumption she'd built her identity upon. Tomorrow they would face each other in combat, would demonstrate to 2 trillion watching beings that partnership didn't mean weakness, that choosing someone as equal didn't diminish your own strength. Kalara slept better that night than she had in years. The championship arena was different from the spaces used for elimination rounds. Larger, more elaborate, designed for maximum dramatic impact. The floor was reinforced to handle the most destructive combat styles. The viewing galleries had been expanded to accommodate the physical presence of dignitaries who normally watch through holographic feeds. Kalara entered from the Champion's Gate, the traditional entrance for the defending title holder. She wore her ceremonial armor, dark metal and bronze polished to mirror brightness. The Valor Stone rested against her shoulder in the formal carry position. The crowd's roar was deafening. She walked to the center of the arena, where the neutral arbiter waited on the judgment platform. The ancient being's translucent form seemed to shimmer with heightened intensity, responding to the significance of the moment. Garrett entered from the challenger's gate. He wore armor that Earth's diplomatic corps had commissioned for him, functional design without unnecessary ornamentation. No weapons beyond what the arena would provide. No ceremonial burden beyond representing his species with honor. They met at the arena's center, standing before the arbiter, with perhaps 5 meters of space between them. The arbiter's voice resonated across all frequencies. This championship match carries significance beyond traditional competition. Both competitors have demonstrated superior capability through legitimate advancement. Both have become subjects of galactic attention due to political circumstances surrounding their participation. The ancient being paused, seemed to consider their next words carefully. It has been suggested that personal relationship between competitors compromises competitive integrity. The tournament committee has reviewed this concern. We find no evidence of collusion or arranged outcomes. Both competitors have fought at full capability throughout elimination rounds. The arbiter's form pulsed with light. Therefore, this match will proceed under standard championship rules. Combat continues until yield or incapacitation. The victor claims the title. The defeated accepts honorable second position. A pause heavy with meaning. However, the committee acknowledges that these competitors may choose to redefine victory through their actions. The tournament will honor whatever outcome emerges from honest combat. With that unprecedented statement, the arbiter descended from the platform, leaving Kalara and Garrett alone in the arena center. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Two beings from different worlds who had found partnership in the space between their differences, who had chosen each other despite every political pressure and cultural expectation pushing them apart. Then Kalara shifted her grip on the Valor Stone, bringing it down from her shoulder to a ready position. Garrett settled into a defensive stance, his body positioning showing the structural understanding that had carried him through every previous match. The signal sounded. They moved. Kalara opened with a traditional Nicerian strike pattern, the kind taught to young warriors learning the foundations of combat. Not her most sophisticated technique, not the devastating combinations she could have used. A test, an invitation, a question asked through movement rather than words. Garrett responded with a defensive sequence that used leverage to redirect her force rather than trying to block it directly. The technique she had taught him during their stolen conversations in maintenance quarters. Evidence that he had learned, that he understood what she was offering. They continued this way for the first several minutes of the match. Each exchange was a conversation. Kalara would demonstrate a technique, Garrett would respond with the counter she'd taught him, then add a variation that showed his own understanding of the principles involved. The crowd fell silent, trying to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't the brutal efficiency of Kalara's elimination matches. This wasn't the structural exploitation that had characterized Garrett's previous victories. This was something else entirely. Kalara felt her pulse quicken as the match progressed. They were demonstrating partnership through combat, showing that perfect understanding of each other's capabilities didn't create weakness. It created something more powerful. A dialogue written in movement and response in the language they developed together. At the 8-minute mark, Kalara shifted to more advanced techniques. Combinations that required split-second timing that exploited gaps in defensive positioning that most opponents wouldn't even notice. Garrett adapted, Not perfectly, not without taking strikes that connected with enough force to leave marks. But he adapted using his structural understanding to predict where her next strike would come from, positioning himself to minimize damage while creating opportunities for counterstrikes. At 12 minutes, Kailira found herself in a position she'd never experienced in championship combat. She had a clear opportunity to end the match. Garrett's defensive positioning had left a gap, a moment of vulnerability that her training screamed at her to exploit. One strike precisely placed would force his yield. She pulled the strike. Not completely. It connected, but with controlled force that caused pain without serious injury. Enough to score the point. Not enough to end the match. Garrett's eyes met hers across the small distance between them. Understanding flickered in his expression. He recognized what she'd done, what she'd chosen not to do. At 15 minutes, the pattern reversed. Garrett had her in a hold that if he applied full force would result in her surrender or serious injury to her shoulder joint. His leverage was perfect. His positioning was flawless. She felt him adjust the pressure, felt him choose restraint over victory, felt the decision he made in the microsecond where he could have ended her championship reign and chose instead to release her. The crowd was starting to understand. This wasn't a fight to determine the stronger competitor. Both of them were demonstrating that they were strong enough to win. What they were actually showing was that they were strong enough to choose not to. At 18 minutes, they separated by mutual unspoken agreement, standing perhaps 3 meters apart, both breathing hard from exertion. The match had pushed them both to significant physical limits, not because either was trying to defeat the other, but because demonstrating perfect control while exhausted was its own kind of test. Kailira made her decision. She raised her hand, the formal signal for a pause in combat. Garrett acknowledged it, settling back into neutral stance. Then Kailira walked to the edge of the arena, to the champion's equipment area, where the Valor Stone rested on its ceremonial stand. She'd placed it there before the match began, as tradition required. Personal weapons were forbidden during championship combat unless both competitors agreed to their use. But what she was about to do wasn't about using the hammer as a weapon. She lifted the Valor Stone, felt its familiar weight settle into her hands. Then she turned and walked back to the center of the arena, to where Garrett waited with an expression that suggested he understood exactly what was happening. The crowd's confusion was palpable. Officials were conferring urgently, trying to determine if this violated tournament protocols. The arbiter watched from their position at the arena's edge, making no move to intervene. Kailira stopped before Garrett. She raised the Valor Stone overhead, with one hand the display of strength that had opened the tournament, a reminder to 2 trillion watching beings of what she was capable of, what her legacy represented. Then she lowered the hammer, extended it toward Garrett with both hands in the formal offering position. Her voice carried across the arena, amplified by systems designed to ensure every word of championship combat was captured. For 12 generations, no male could lift my warhammer. The weight was considered absolute, proof of supremacy that could not be matched. She met Garrett's eyes directly. Garrett Holloway can lift it. Not because he's stronger than me, because strength isn't about supremacy, it's about understanding, about recognizing that different parameters create different possibilities, about choosing who you share your power with. Garrett stepped forward, placed his hands on the Valor Stone's handle below hers. Together, they raised it overhead, both hands on the ancient weapon, equal partners in bearing its weight. I choose him as my equal. Kailira continued. The words came in her native language first, then translated to Galactic Standard. My partner in strength and vulnerability. What I carry alone becomes lighter when shared. What we face together becomes possible instead of impossible. The arena had fallen into absolute silence. Even the officials had stopped conferring, transfixed by what they were witnessing. This match cannot be decided by traditional victory, Kailira said, because we've already won what matters. We've proven that strength can coexist with choice. That power doesn't require dominance. That different species can find partnership instead of hierarchy. She lowered the hammer with Garrett, both of them guiding it down together. Then she extended her free hand to him. Not as opponent accepting defeat, not as champion offering consolation, as partner acknowledging what they had built together. Garrett took her hand. The arbiter moved forward, ascending to the judgment platform with movements that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Their voice resonated across all frequencies with unusual intensity. In all recorded tournament history, the arbiter began, "No championship match has concluded in this manner." The rules provide no framework for what these competitors have demonstrated. A pause that seemed to stretch into eternity. Therefore, the tournament committee must create new framework. This match is concluded not by defeat but by mutual demonstration of superior philosophy. Both competitors have proven capability to win. Both have chosen to redefine what victory means. The arbiter's form pulsed with brilliant light. Kalira Thane retains her championship title, having demonstrated strength sufficient to defend it. Garrett Holloway is named champion's equal, having demonstrated strength sufficient to match it. Together, they have shown us that the future of strength lies not in domination, but in chosen partnership. The crowd's response started slowly, confusion transforming into understanding, understanding into appreciation, appreciation into something that sounded like revelation. 2 trillion beings across the galaxy watching as two competitors from different worlds rewrote the rules of what strength could mean. Kalira felt tears on her face again. But these were different from every previous time she'd cried. Not grief, not relief, or joy at the realization that she had spent 28 years of preparing for this moment without knowing it. She had thought the championship was about proving her supremacy, about demonstrating that she was unmatchable, about accepting isolation as the price of power. Instead, the championship had become about proving that strength had more possibilities than her culture had taught her, about demonstrating that being matched didn't diminish her power, about choosing partnership over solitude and discovering that the choice itself was what made her truly free. Garrett pulled her close and she let him abandon the careful control she'd maintained throughout her public life. Let 2 trillion beings see that the champion was also just a person who had found someone who made her feel like she was enough exactly as she was. The following week passed in a blur of political chaos that Kalira observed with distant interest. The conspiracy sanctions were formalized. 17 species faced trade restrictions and diplomatic consequences. Nicerian leadership underwent forced restructuring, with several high-ranking officials removed from positions for their role in approving the assassination plot. Earth's diplomatic position strengthened dramatically. The humanity that had been treated as peripheral participant 7 years ago was suddenly negotiating major trade agreements from a position of unexpected power. And Kalira existed in the strange space between exile and transformation. She had lost her military rank, her position within Nicerian power structures, the respect that came from being celebrated representative of her species. But she had gained international recognition as someone who had chosen truth over loyalty, partnership over supremacy, integrity over political convenience. The neutral arbiters offered her a position they'd created specifically for her circumstances. Ambassador of Evolved Strength Doctrine. Essentially, they wanted her to travel among species who were struggling with the implications of what she demonstrated, helping them understand that hierarchies built on dominance were failing because they measured strength too narrowly. Garrett was offered a parallel position. Cultural exchange envoy specializing in interspecies partnership frameworks. Together, they would work to reshape galactic understanding of what strength could mean when it was chosen freely rather than imposed through force. They accepted the positions, knowing it meant their lives would be complicated in ways they couldn't fully anticipate. Constant scrutiny, political pressure, being defined by their association with each other and what they represented. But they had each other, and that made everything else manageable. 6 months later, Kalira stood in the ancestral chamber of her family's estate on the Nicerian homeworld. She had returned for the first time since the tournament, uncertain of her reception. Her government had stripped her of rank, but her family's response had been more complex. Her mother waited in the chamber, standing beside the mounting where the Valor Stone had rested for generations between tournaments. Matriarch Thane was stern military and bearing her golden eyes so similar to Kalira's own that it was like looking at what she might become in 30 years. "You brought him," her mother said without preamble, looking past Kalira to where Garrett stood respectfully at the chamber entrance. Kalira nodded. "He's my bonded partner, by Nicerian law and by choice. I won't hide that or apologize for it." Her mother studied Garrett for a long moment. Then she gestured him forward. "Come here, human. Let me see you properly." Garrett approached with the same calm he'd shown throughout everything. He stopped before Matriarch Thane, meeting her gaze without challenge, but without submission either. Equal acknowledgement. My daughter performed the weapon-sharing ritual with you, Matriarch Thane said. A ceremony that 12 generations of Thane women performed only to face failure and disappointment. You lifted our ancestral hammer when no male of our species could. Tell me why I should accept this. Garrett was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. I can't give you a reason to accept it based on Nisarian traditions. By your species standards, I'm probably not worthy of Kalira. I'm not from a warrior culture. I don't have military rank or political position. I'm just an engineer who happened to have physiological advantages that your culture's parameters didn't account for. He glanced at Kalira, then back to her mother. But I can tell you what I see when I look at your daughter. Not a champion who was too strong to be matched. A person who was told her entire life that her power made her unlovable and who believed it because 23 males failed a test that was designed with the wrong parameters. His voice strengthened slightly. I see someone who chose truth over loyalty to a government that betrayed her, who exposed conspiracy at the cost of everything her species taught her to value, who demonstrated strength through choosing partnership instead of proving dominance. If you can't accept me, I understand, but I'm not going anywhere because Kalira is the most remarkable person I've ever met, and I refuse to let her be alone just because your culture couldn't recognize what it had. The silence that followed was absolute. Kalira held her breath, uncertain how her mother would respond to words that bordered on challenge. Then Matriarch Thane did something Kalira had never seen in her entire life. She smiled. Actually smiled, not the formal expression of approval that Nisarian culture considered appropriate, but genuine warmth. 12 generations, we believe the strongest female must wait alone, her mother said. We built our entire lineage around the assumption that power demanded isolation. You've proven we were wrong. Not just wrong about parameters, wrong about what strength should mean. She placed her hand on Garrett's shoulder, the Nisarian gesture of family acceptance. You honored our legacy by evolving it, by showing us that the hammer doesn't have to be burden of solitude. It can be foundation for partnership. Kalira felt something she'd been holding tight inside her chest finally release. Her mother's acceptance. Not grudging tolerance. Actual recognition that what she'd chosen had value. The matriarch turned to Kalira. You've been offered positions teaching new strength doctrine. Will you accept? We already have, Kalira said. Both of us. We'll be traveling, working with spies who are struggling to understand what we demonstrated. Good. Her mother's golden eyes gleamed with something that might have been pride. Then perhaps you should start here, with our own people. We have young warriors who need to understand that finding an equal isn't failure. It's the truest victory. Over the next several days, Kalira and Garrett worked with a group of young Nisarian warriors, both male and female, teaching them about leverage and physics and the concept that strength was contextual rather than absolute. One young female, perhaps 20 years old, with the kind of natural power that reminded Kalira of her younger self, approached her during a training break. How did you know, the young warrior asked? That it was right to choose partnership over tradition, Kalira considered the question carefully. I didn't know. Not with certainty. I just knew that spending the rest of my life alone believing I was unmatchable felt like prison. When Garrett lifted my hammer, it didn't make me weaker. It made me free, because suddenly I had choice instead of just accepting what my culture told me was inevitable. But what if people say you're betraying our species? The young warrior pressed. What if they say you chose an outsider over your own people? Let them say it, Kalira replied. I chose truth. I chose integrity. I chose partnership with someone who sees my strength and isn't intimidated by it. If my species views that as betrayal, then maybe our species needs to evolve. She smiled at the young warrior. You're not too strong to be matched. You've just been measuring yourself against too narrow a baseline. Keep that in mind when you start performing courtship rituals. Don't accept failure 23 times because the parameters are wrong. Question the parameters themselves. On their last night before departing for their next assignment, Kalira and Garrett stood on a balcony overlooking the Nisarian capital as the twin stars that warmed her homeworld rose over the horizon. The light was different from Earth's single sun, casting everything in subtle dual shadows that Garrett said he was still learning to navigate. This is strange, Garrett said quietly. 6 months ago, I was a structural engineer in Colorado. Now I'm standing on an alien world bonded to a galactic champion working to reshape how strength is understood across multiple species. Kalira leaned against him, comfortable with the physical closeness that had become natural between them. Strange is one word for it. Revolutionary might be another. Do you ever regret it? He asked. Everything you lost because of me? She turned to face him directly. I lost a government position I never wanted, military rank that came with obligations I resented, the approval of leadership that was willing to kill me for political convenience. What did I actually lose that mattered? Your place in your culture, Garrett said. Your connection to your species. Kalira shook her head. I gained the freedom to define my own place, to build connection based on choice rather than just accepting what tradition demanded. And I gained you. Someone who looked at my hammer and saw puzzle instead of symbol, who helped me understand that strength has more possibilities than I'd been taught. She took his hand, intertwined their fingers. I spent 28 years carrying weight alone and believing that was the only way strength could exist. You taught me that sharing weight doesn't make it heavier. It makes both people stronger because they're choosing to bear it together. The twin stars continued their rise, painting the horizon in colors that Earth had never seen. Kalira watched the light spread across the capital city, where she'd been celebrated and feared and ultimately exiled from. But exile didn't feel like loss anymore. It felt like liberation. Where to next, Garrett asked. The schedule has us visiting the Corellian homeworld to work with their military academies. Kalira smiled. Then we'd better prepare for hostile reception. The Corellians lost significant economic advantages because of the conspiracy exposure. They're not going to appreciate being lectured about evolved strength doctrine by the people who cost them power. Think we can change their minds? She considered the question seriously. Maybe not all of them, but if we can reach even a few, help them understand that partnership can be stronger than dominance, it's worth the effort. They stood together as the twin stars completed their rise, bathing the balcony in light that eliminated the dual shadows Garrett had been learning to navigate. In full illumination, there was only one shadow. Theirs merged together by proximity and choice. You know what the most remarkable thing is, Garrett said. 6 months ago, no male could lift your warhammer. That fact defined your entire life, shaped everything you believed about yourself and your future. And now the hammer is just a tool, he said. Beautiful, historically significant, symbolically important, but just a tool. The real strength was never in whether someone could lift it. It was in your willingness to question everything you'd been taught when you discovered the parameters were wrong. Kalira felt truth settle into that observation. The Valor Stone had been her burden and her legacy and her isolation for so long. But what had truly changed wasn't the hammer's weight. It was her understanding that weight could be shared. That strength could be measured in more ways than her culture had recognized. That the solitude she'd accepted as permanent was actually just failure of imagination. The future stretched before them, uncertain and complicated and full of challenges they couldn't fully anticipate. There would be species who rejected what they were teaching. Political forces that would try to use them as symbols for agendas they didn't support. Constant scrutiny of their partnership, looking for evidence that it compromised rather than enhanced their individual strengths. But they had each other, and they had discovered something that no amount of political pressure could take away. Strength didn't require solitude. Power didn't demand dominance. And love, when chosen freely between equals, was the strongest force in the galaxy. Together, carrying the weight they'd chosen to share, they turned from the balcony and moved toward whatever came next. The Valor Stone hammer rested in their quarters, mounted between their workspaces. No longer symbol of one person's isolation. Instead, reminder of what two people could achieve when they measured strength by new parameters. When they chose partnership over supremacy. When they recognized that being matched didn't diminish power, it made both people free.